Thomas the Hermit, and this is my YouTube channel. I talk about prayer, I talk about other things that are important in the Catholic Church. Now this is continuing my thing on the book by Malachi Martin, which is The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, and the Betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church. Now I already did an intro on the topic, and now I'm gonna hit some hard-hitting stuff. I'm just gonna start reading. I think you'll get the gist of what I'm trying to say. And this is from the book, and it's from the 4th chapter, and it's called Papal Humiliation. Okay, check this out. From the very moment the Pontiffs Alitila DC-10 glided into its approach over Managua's Caesar Augustus Sandino Airport that March 4th morning, the cameras glinted in the sunlight below, began their busy whirring. They followed the touchdown and hovered their focus on the airliner until it stopped near the waiting dignitaries of the Sandinista regime and the carefully selected crowd of onlookers. The Sandinista clack, they zoomed in on the door of the plane, then until at last it opened and Pope John Paul stepped into its frame, his robes gleaming white as he emerged from the interior darkness. The Pope descended to the tarmac and knelt to kiss the ground, in that gesture that had become so familiar to hundreds of millions of people around the world. From that moment on, everything was in the hands of the junta. Daniel Ortega, as leader and spokesman for the Sandinista government, welcomed His Holiness with a 25-minute abusive tirade against the United States. In utter delight that the Pontiff's arrival, covered here as everywhere by the world press, gave Ortega his first truly international platform. John Paul listened, chin cupped in one hand, head bowed, his eyes on the ground. He had heard all this before from Polish communist commissars and village Marxists. John Paul's moment finally came to speak in reply to Ortega's bellicose and deliberately discourteous welcoming speech. The pontiff prepared remarks in praise of Managua's Archbishop Obando y Bravo were greeted with perfectly timid hoots or derision from the organized and well-marshaled Sandinista claque. His words denouncing the People's Church as a grave deviation from the will and salvation of Jesus Christ were all but drowned out from first to last by loud and continuing shouts and catcalls. The Sandinistas' leaders had reason for deep satisfaction here. At least this Pole would not be able to speak over their heads to the people. He would not have a voice in deciding the fate of Nicaragua. John Paul concluded his prepared-arrived speech with pain and anger in his voice. He passed down the receiving line, shaking hands perfunctorily with junta members and National Directorate commanders. Certain cabinet members were conspicuous by their absence. The foreign minister, Maryknoll Father Miguel de Escoto, found it more convenient to be in New Delhi. The OAS ambassador, Father Edgar Perales, and the state delegate Jesuit, Father Alvaro Arguello, were each at home watching this indignities on television. Jesuit Father Fernando Cardinal was also absent. His brother, Father Ernesto Cardinal, was the lone ranking government priest in attendance, a bespectable figure whose rustic white cotton shirt, baggy blue trousers, and black beret were uncomfortably out of sync with his shiny black shoes. Of all those gathered to welcome the Holy Father to this overwhelmingly Catholic country, Ernesto Cardinal alone dropped to one knee as the Pope stopped in front of him. He removed his beret and put his hand to take the Pope's and kiss his ring. But John Paul did not extend his hand. Instead, he wagged an admonishing finger at Ernesto. "You must regularize your situation." The pontiff spoke in a clear voice, and then repeated his words for emphasis. "You must regularize your situation." Cardinal only his reply was to stare back, smiling at His Holiness. John Paul passed down the remainder of the receiving line and departed from the first portion of his planned itinerary in Nicaragua, a visit to the city of Leon, some 40 miles to the northwest of Managua. The reception at San Benito Airport was but a thin and reedy overture to the full symphony of humiliation that had been orchestrated for John Paul, to be performed before the world at the climax of his papal visit. The public mass that was the centerpiece of John Paul's visit was to be celebrated that evening in the spacious plaza of July 19th, named for the day in 1979 when the Somoza dictatorship had been smashed and the Marxist junta of the Sandinistas had taken power. The setting sun splashed its red-gold rays on an unforgettable scene as John Paul II entered the plaza, clad in full pontifical robes, papal mitre on his head, papal staff held uprightly in his hand. The crowd jammed into the plaza, officially estimated at 600,000, was all neatly sorted out and massed in prearranged blocks. One end of the packed plaza was spanned by an enormous black drop of revolutionary billboards depicting the heroes of the Sandinista Revolution. Facing the billboards on the opposite side of the plaza, a long wooden platform with a railing had been constructed. An altar, a simple long table draped for the occasion with linen, had been placed on the platform. On either side of the platform facing the crowds were two official viewing stands where the 3-man junta and the 9-man National Directorate waited, all 12 clad in olive green army fatigues. In the places closest to the makeshift platform and its flanking reviewing stand, the junta had arranged special blocks of supporting, provided with the megaphones and microphones, pickups everywhere on buildings surrounding the plaza on the billboards. In the hands of the crowds around the platforms and altar itself were red and black Sandinista flags. Here and there a yellow and white Vatican flag popped up, and there was a smattering of blue and white Nicaraguan flags. Tauntingly, Ortega and his colleagues had ordered hung at backdrop to the altar a mural depicting in enormous proportions the faces of Carlos Fonseca Amador, hero martyr of the Sandinista Revolution, and Augusto Cesar Sandino, the man in whose name the Sandinistas had made their revolution. There was no crucifix above the altar. The immemorial Catholic practice had been forbidden by the young rulers of Nicaragua. In its place had been stretched yet another long banner, this one emblazoned with man-sized letter, "John Paul is here, thanks to God and the Revolution." As always, there was such a mass of people is gathered together, there was never a moment of silence. Mass crowds, unless they are silenced by something extraordinary, a spellbinding orator, a dazzling spectacle, amid a continuous rumble and jumble of sound. That evening the plaza echoed with the same rumbles, punctuated with nicely timed bursts of cheering and occasional singing and chanting. John Paul began his mass tranquilly. He was used to the behavior of crowds. When the moment came for him to deliver his prepared homily, a vigorous onslaught on the people's church, he appeared surprised that even the microphones that had been set up for him could not overcome the well-rehearsed and beautifully timed cacophony that now rose from the crowd, an ear-splitting litany of rhythmic revolutionary slogans. The claque started even before the homily began. In fact, when John Paul strained to make his deep voice resound over the competition, the litany of the crowd became thunderously loud and as regular as the heartbeats. Power to the people. National Directorate, give us your orders. Speak to us of the poor. Progressively, John Paul could barely be heard. His sympathizers tried to protest to make their support for him heard, but they had been located as far as possible from the platform and had neither megaphones nor microphones. John Paul could be seen, his hands slicing the air treacherously in violent gestures, but he could not be heard above the incessant clanging of the Sandinista slogans. We want a united church on the side of the poor. There's no contradiction between Christianity and revolution. John Paul's face became livid with indignation as he realized what was happening. He was being trapped and nullified in a well of noise. In anger and desperation, he finally shouted, "Silencio!" In the well-orchestrated symphony of the claque, the Pope's command was but a signal to increase the tempo of the slogans. "Silencio!" John Paul shouted a second time. A new crescendo of slogans engulfed him. A third time, "Silencio!" The word accompanied now by a staying gesture of his hand. An unimaginably loud chorus of power to the people, Christ lives in the people's church, overwhelmed his effort. The crowd was beyond his control. Anger, John Paul shouted a taunt into his microphone, his fully filled glance shooting over at the junta in their reviewing stand. Mosquito power. The taunt hit home. The Mosquito Indians were in dire opposition to the Sandinistas, and the junta had been doing its utmost to liquidate them. The response was instantaneous. The 9 military commanders of the National Directorate and the junta raised their clenched fists to urge the block of slogan chanters to even greater efforts. Simultaneously, government technicians connected to the microphones of the clacks surrounded the platform to the main loudspeaker system over which John Paul had been trying to make himself heard. That done, and to swell still further the sound already drowning out the Pope, they threw a switch to cut in a pre-recorded taping of crowds chanting Sandinista slogans. Finally, the thumping cascade of amplifier shouts defeated John Paul. He did not finish his homily, but even when that was not enough for the junta, the slogans continued through the entire sacrifice of the Mass, drowning even its most sacred moments, the consecration and cries of power to the people, and it is possible to be Marxist and Christian, and to speak to us about the injustice of capitalism. Yet still the humiliation was not complete. When John Paul and his entourage took their seats in the Italia DC-10 at Managua's airport that night, and the pilot notified the control tower that he was ready for takeoff, the junta ordered the papal plane to be kept waiting an extra 10 minutes on the ground. It was their final gesture to underline who was really in control here. Okay. Wow. When I read that in Malachi Martin's book, the description of what the Sandinistas did, kind of look what that card tried to just drown me out just now, but kind of what the Sandinistas did to him, I had never heard that before. I've never heard how they humiliated John Paul II and drove him out of the country and didn't let him say a single word to promote the true Catholic Church in Nicaragua. Now, that's part of the story of what